This is my failing. Share your diverse stories of resistance, and that's what I want to talk about today. I would first say something about new forms of racism, about ways of oppression, and about the need to share stories of resistance as a way of resistance in itself. When I developed the concept of everyday racism in the 1980s and wrote 2 books about the problem, I wanted to find a place in race theory for the many seemingly small experiences of racial discrimination, the humiliation and rejections that hurt, but which are hard to prove because the offender would always deny racism intent, would accuse us of being oversensitive. I also wanted to create a space for the knowledge about racism that emerges from its experience. Many oppressed communities have what the famous US scholar W.E.B. Du Bois has called a double consciousness, and somebody mentioned it earlier today. Understanding of their culture from the lived experience, but also an awareness of how the dominant perceptions misrepresent black and brown people's lives through racist constructions. Racism is recognized often in extreme forms. It's often recognized also when it's overt. For instance, a white Dutch man calling a black colleague a monkey when he eats a banana. And these are real cases, which is similar to black players getting bananas thrown at them on the Italian and other football fields in Europe. Everyday racism can be more coded. For instance, the white teacher who congratulates white students for performing very well, but ignores the Surinamese Dutch or the Moroccan Dutch student who excels. It can be ingrained in institutional practice, for instance, appointing friends of friends for a position as a result of which the workplace remains white. Often it is not even consciously intended. For instance, having black colleagues sit on every diversity committee to add color to, or to comply to institutional rules, but at the same time not giving the credit for that. So they're more or less doing that in their free, private time. Just some snapshots. I want to say something about a new phenomenon which I have been working on, and some of which is also in the book Dutch Racism, but I call it entitlement racism. Entitlement it's very difficult to translate in Dutch. It would be, if I would translate it in Dutch, I would say that ik mag racisme. And it will become clear why I would translate it in Dutch. When you say entitlement, it's something like you have the right, it's your right to have. The phrase, I don't want to be racist, but, and then you continue to say something racist nevertheless. You don't hear that much anymore these days. It used to be an excuse that you would often hear in the 1980s. The backlash against anti-racism started at the end of the previous century, and subsequently fed by the post-9/11 war on terror in the US and Europe, has given birth to a new boldness. Truth-telling, speaking your mind about ethnic minorities. Now, racism legitimized in terms of rights people claim, and more particularly the right of freedom of expression, is what I call entitlement racism. Entitlement is a sign of the times we live in, where it is believed that you should be able to express yourself publicly in whichever way you feel like. Freedom of expression, though an individual right, is quintessentially also a relational phenomenon. The expressor wants his or her opinion to be heard and seen. Followers, those who applaud, and even those whose silence is read as approval, can become partial in the enactment of entitlement racism. Freedom of expression as a form of racism evolves easily into the idea that one has the right to offend and to humiliate. Highly politicized, extreme examples of entitlement racism, in particular against Muslims and Islam, come to mind, including anti-Islamic films and cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. But a number of public events give rise to believe that racism against people of African descent in Europe, too, is taking more blunt, openly racial forms in the name of freedom of expression. Think of the many openly racist slurs in the wake of the campaign against Zwarte Piet. It's just astonishing. Even when I'm in the US, da-da-da, you have one click away from websites, etc., so I can follow a lot. Whereas the violation of the integrity of the black body is not new, what makes a lot of the verbal and virtual examples entitlement racism is that the perpetrators know, or they could have known, that their portrayals are offensive. But they do not see any reason to apologize or change their behavior anymore. We are in a time where there has been enough published about racism that everybody can know what it is. Instead, they become defensive. At the same time, entitlement racism, and that's the other side of the coin, triggers increasing anger and confidence among activists against racism. Indeed, you can speak now of a second wave of anti-racism since the 1980s. And young people, like the New Urban Collective, have an important role in this. Congratulations. Let me say something about opposition against racism. To expose and to reject racism verbally is one thing. To act accordingly is another. Courageous step. There are many ordinary people who are extraordinary in refusing to accept discrimination, racist comments, and other manifestations intended to undermine human dignity. The profile of people engaged in creating just societies free from racism cuts through gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and color. Many are in lone positions, some are in leadership positions. We can encourage and support those who are exposed to racism, personally, vicariously, or as a witness, by intervening and taking a firm stand against discrimination, against racist jokes, against racially and ethnically offensive comments, and other prejudiced remarks. We can also do so in our smaller, we can all do that in our smaller or bigger ways on the basis of at least 5 principles, what I call the 5 R's. 1, recognize. 2, register. 3, reject. 4, replace. And 5, silence. And I will say briefly something about each of these principles. 1, recognize. Recognize racism as a societal problem. The experience of racial discrimination can trigger strong emotions, including shame, anger, and hurt. Denial does not solve the problem. Facing racism for what it is, recognizing the powerful effect it can have on health and well-being, does not mean that you are powerless, oversensitive, or a failure in life. Always keep in mind, when people tell you you're oversensitive, it means that they are not sensitive. And compared to that, you seem oversensitive. So if you develop your sensitivity about what racism is, others will call you oversensitive. Don't take it. Recognizing and the point at the racism is and point out that racism is a way of protecting your dignity in a situation of exposure of undignified behavior. Racism is undignified behavior on that behavioral level. 2, register instances of everyday racism. Keep, memorize, report, and collect events of everyday racism. The more evidence there is, the more difficult it becomes to continue to dismiss everyday racism as oversensitivity. Write down your personal stories and in and outside of institutions. Share examples through the social media, the website, blogs, YouTube, other channels. Naming or companies and organizations involved can be a very effective tool. It may shame organizations into taking actions, warn people of color to avoid, or others who are against racism, to avoid applying for a job there or lead to boycotts against the company product. 3rd, reject. Reject discrimination and racist discourses. Use the moments where you witness everyday racism to point out that racism and discrimination is against the law and that it's morally objectionable. Use your voice to state that only people who lack wisdom and courage engage in racist jokes and other offensive comments about ethnic groups. Your own example of courage and integrity in voicing objections against racism can inspire others to do the same. I have learned from my experiences in advisory work with policymakers, NGOs, with students, etc., that good examples can make a difference. If you see, oh, that is how he does it, or that is what she has done, maybe I can do the same. 4, replace. We can live another practice in which we do not discriminate, but instead acknowledge the inherent worth of all human beings. Many feel inspired when someone takes action against racism, standing firm and decisive in honoring the dignity and individuality of all human beings. Building empathy across ethnic boundaries is a good way of facilitating a practice without discrimination. Finally, the R of resilience. Do not give up, bounce back. More than anything, resilience can be maintained through a strong sense of self-worth and dignity. And all these notions have been evoked today in terms of verantwoordelijkheid, responsibility, taking action. Now, the 5 R's of recognize, register, reject, replace, and resilience brings me to a question that has been with me throughout my adult life. Why do some people resist oppression and oppressive conditions and others not? And later, as an academic engaged in racism research, I wondered about anti-racist colleagues. What has happened in their lives to move them to take an unconventional, often difficult path ridden with risks, career risks, political risks, sometimes even risks of losing friends or family support? Resistance in view of justice is a form of leadership. It's about taking risks in order to set a different example. Share your stories. Share your stories, your own experience, what happens in family and community, stories of resistance. Whose example inspired you? How did you learn to reject racism, to talk back? Share the stories of your own examples and your own resistance. This has a double effect. First, the effect of rejection, and second, rejection that is not accepting racism, and second, the effect of inspiring others with your own example. How much time do I have? 10 more minutes? Is that okay? You're not tired yet? No. Your own story of resistance is never a personal story. An individual relates to family, friends, colleagues, and others. An individual connects to a larger context of shared cultural, economic, political, religious, and national experiences. Sharing and collecting stories of resistance makes it possible to put the person in a comprehensive context. You understand so much more when you know where people are coming from and why, and that you hear through stories. I use this biographical method, that is stories, in my study of everyday racism, in a climate where there was racism denial in the Netherlands. I interviewed women of color in the Netherlands and the United States, this was in the 1980s, about their racial experiences in order to understand mine story, mine experience. And in the same vein, I could understand their stories because I had gone through some of their same experiences. Apart from an analysis of micro-expressions of subtle racism in everyday life, I was also interested in the knowledge structure. What kind of knowledge do they have about racism? How do we know that racism is involved? We used to think it's intuition. What I analyzed and laid out is that it's a quick use of knowledge. And only very recently there has been research outside of the context of racism, but research about intuition that shows indeed that intuition, it's integrated knowledge that you very quickly use. I also in my research discovered something very unexpected. One that had to do with the impact of knowledge of racism on the experience and interpretation of everyday racism. I found that women who had general knowledge of racism, often through the stories of their family, would not take racism in everyday interactions as personal or as personal failure, but they immediately would recognize it as a systemic phenomenon. And you know the difference. If you think it's personal, you think there's something wrong with me. If you know it's systemic, there's something wrong with the system. Even when it means that you have to take double responsibility in order to change, because if you sit, nothing is going to change. Let me end by saying something about the relevance of examples and the way we communicate and work with each other. For many people, Nelson Mandela has been a shining example of his ability to reconcile immensely trying experiences into constructive resistance and leadership with dignity. Another South African example is Desmond Tutu, the quintessential example of resistance leadership, as expressed in the title of his authorized biography, Rebel Browser for Peace, written by John Allen. Tutu regarded his mother as, and I quote him, the single greatest influence in his life. And I'm going to quote what he says about his mother. He says, "I resemble her in many ways. She was stumpy and she had a big nose like mine. And I hope that I resemble her in another respect. She was very, very gentle and compassionate and caring, always taking the side of whoever was having the worst of an argument. She was also quite incredible about wanting to share. She never cooked just enough for the family. She always imagined that there was going to be someone else who came and for whom she must dish up. Even when we didn't have a great deal to share, we would share, even that little bit that we had." End of quote. Although his mother's example partly shaped his compassion for the underdog and his commitment to social justice, later, as a spiritual leader himself and a campaigner for human rights, he could hold on to the phrase his father taught him. When Tutu would feel outraged, incensed to the bones about injustice happening, he recalled his father's voice, saying, "Don't raise your voice, improve your argument." I hope you take this with you. This brings me back to resilience and to the dignity of struggle for social justice. Maintain your dignity, whatever the circumstance, which means never lose sight of the fact that no matter how much you disagree, every human being deserves to be treated with humaneness, with respect for their worth as a human being, regardless whether you have respect for what they say or what they represent. They have worth as human beings, and I hope you take this with you.